In this video, I'll be sharing the full process of sculpting a water dragon onto a lidded jar. This style of dragon could be sculpted onto any form, whether wheel thrown or hand built. This form was thrown on the wheel with a 4-pound ball of clay. To give you a cohesive overview of the entire process, I will share a brief demonstration on how I created this form. I've been creating my pottery on the wheel for over a decade and have learned a lot of life lessons in the process. Since most of my creations are a combination of wheel-thrown pieces and sculpture, there are sometimes months that go by without touching the wheel. When consistent, it becomes an amazing meditation. This piece was thrown in 2 parts. I'm throwing the lid and measuring the circumference with a caliper tool to fit snugly onto the jar. There are many steps that go into a handmade piece of ceramic art, and each step takes a lot of practice to perfect. I'm trimming the foot to have a nice clean appearance, and trimming the lid to fit flush onto the jar, and refining the shape directly on the wheel. I wanted to create a texture that hinted at the appearance of water by simply carving a continuous pattern along the surface with a loop tool. If you want to see the whole process of throwing and carving this jar, check out my previous ASMR video, How to Throw a Tall Jar and Carve Texture. I like to create the body of the dragon as one piece by rolling out a long coil. This is great practice to sculpt and hand build all sorts of things out of clay. I basically roll out the snake shape and sculpt a general shape for the head. I approach sculpting a dragon in a very similar way that you would sculpt a snake, even though the dragon will have a very different look in the end. It helps to create those initial broad shapes with symmetry and the final appearance in mind. To attach the dragon's body to the form, I drape the coil around it and mark the placement with a blunt tool. I follow along the line and score the area with a wire brush tool, and score the underside of the coil. Scoring the area opens up the clay particles to introduce slip into. The slip helps work the 2 clay surfaces together to create a bond. With pressure and friction, the clay will mix and fuse together. I go along the entire coil and press gently to ensure that any air escapes and the pieces merge. Once attached, I shape the pieces to have an indication of the spine and the motion of the dragon wrapping its body around the piece. Once attached, I go along the seam with a flat loop tool to smear the clay from the dragon onto the surface of the clay pot. This will ensure that the pieces are connected well and the chances of them separated will be averted. With a sponge, I clean up any marks or extra clay I left behind. I find it helpful to begin with the eyes and start to see the character take shape. The placement of the eyes will often define the character of the piece, so it's a great place to start and to practice. I also find it easier to build the other facial features around the initial eye shape. When building the initial forms of the body, like the legs and the arms, I try to just get general shapes formed that I'll be able to carve and attach more muscular definition to later. To create almost any form, I begin with a ball of clay and shape it from there. With these, I roll out some coils and create very simplified shapes to begin with. I want the shapes to be symmetrical so that shaping them later is easier. When attaching, I repeat the same steps of tracing the shape onto the form, scoring the area, painting on slip, and connecting with pressure and friction. At this point, I'm not concerned with the way the arms look. I'm just wanting to build a shape that I can sculpt onto. Think of it more as a clay armature than a final shape. Once it's attached, I go in and carve musculature and definition by taking the clay away and also adding to it. That's the beauty of working with clay. You can add and subtract and change the piece as long as the clay is workable. And I find that this is a really freeing process of sketching out the pieces without taking time trying to refine it. At this point in the sculpture, it may look super amateur, but I assure you to trust the process and the shapes will begin to emerge. Even with the foot that I initially started with, I ended up changing it later. The initial sculpture sketch can be a great time to get ideas for different placements and gives you direct visual feedback. I wanted the feet to appear as if they're swimming through water. I like to experiment with different approaches to sculpting, whether I'm building up the shape slowly, bit by bit, or carving it away to reveal the shape. Even with the hands, I decided to take a very loose approach to sculpting by starting with a ball of clay to carve from. Hands can be a tricky thing to sculpt. I think about the shapes in simplified geometric forms to begin with, and am carving away clay to create a flat, rectangular shape of the hand, and carving away indentations for the fingers, and adding bits of clay to define the knuckles. When sculpting, I have a tendency to jump around the sculpture and build it up slowly without worrying about too much detail. At this point, I'm still building up the overall shapes to create horns and details to the head of the dragon. I like to create a variety of horn sizes to build up around the face just by adding a little water and smearing them onto the surface. I wanted the dragon to appear to be a creature of water, so I'm adding tendrils and scales to the face. I'm sculpting the shape of the nose bridge by carving some clay and placing the nostrils. I want this dragon to appear friendly and almost dog-like. Exploring characters in clay is a great way to expand your imagination and creativity. With fantasy creatures, they can be built from your imagination by using references of other animals or stories of those creatures. Dragons have been woven into cultures worldwide and have taken on many forms. I like to do visual meditations that allow me to explore some of those concepts in my own mind. And some of the visualizations have been very different than any interpretations that I've seen before. I've always loved folklore and fantasy and find the act of sculpting creatures from my own interpretations to be very nourishing for my creative spirit. It is a gift to explore one's imagination and keep it intact as we age, and it contributes to the imagination of others. Rolling out coils is an art form in itself. It's important to maintain consistent pressure in a fluid motion. I find a lot of techniques in hand building or sculpting overlap. The way I'm rolling out these balls of clay can have many applications, from creating texture, making beads, to prepping for building a mane along the spine, like I'm doing here. In preparation for attaching the mane, I'm scoring the area and adding slip. Sometimes this step is not necessary if the clay textures are similar, but since the dragon's body has been setting up for a while, it's helpful to introduce moisture to the clay so that they can be well connected. I'm creating little cones and attaching them by overlapping in a repeating pattern along the spine. Again, I'm adding more clay than what will be there in the end. I'm wanting extra clay to carve once all the pieces are in place. The process of sketching out the piece before detail is added can sometimes open up your imagination to other possibilities. It's important to allow the creative process to unfold without critiquing it too much before it's even been able to express what is possible. The critic can kill creativity, so when I'm creating something new, I try not to judge my work as I'm creating it. After adding the details along the spine, I begin to build up the thorax of the body and adding shoulder blades and other muscular groups. I'm adding detail along the entirety of the spine. Something I could have done differently would have been to just roll out the coil and attach it along the body and carve out detail afterwards. But again, there are infinite ways to approach sculpture, and there isn't one way of doing so. Once the clay is set up a little, I went along and carved out the mane to have the appearance of hair in motion. The tail needed some extra hair and fins, so I rolled out a coil and cut out a general shape to add to the tail. I wanted it to have a look of feathery fins on the tail. So once I attached it, I go back and carve the details. Now that the overall composition is in place, I'm ready to create more detail, and still adding little details like the ears and fins on the arms. Since this is a water dragon, I added webbing between the arms and the torso. By just adding clay and carving it into my desired shape, I imagined that water dragons would have webbing in between all their appendages. I was looking at other sea creatures and was inspired by the way seahorses have trunk ridges along their bodies, so I went along the dragon and carved out indentations to insinuate that kind of physical structure. It will be subtle, but add an interesting texture to the body. I could have went with this idea even more, but I like the subtlety I went for. In preparation for carving the texture, I went along the entire sculpture and lightly sponged the body to create an even surface to carve onto. I have to let the sculpture dry a bit before carving it, or the clay has a tendency to stick to itself. I attempted to start carving before the clay was dry enough. I found it to be unnecessarily difficult to get the detail I was going for, especially on the face where I need to be more intentional, so I had to wait a little before proceeding. Sometimes I have an idea of a texture I want and don't have the tool to create it, so I went ahead and carved a tool out of a bamboo skewer with my super nifty wood carving toolkit. I was wanting a certain shape of scale for the dragon's body and was able to carve the shape easily. I wrapped the tool with some sinew thread to have a more comfortable grip. Once I had my tool, I went along and pressed it into the clay, creating one scale at a time. This was a very meditative process and took me over an hour to complete. The scale pattern is very beautiful and simple to create. Most patterns in nature are comprised of simple patterns repeating to create more elaborate continuous patterns. I went along the body of the dragon with a loop tool to carve an outline that distinguished the dragon from the pot. This not only looks aesthetically pleasing, but helps with the glazing process in the future. I find a lot of peace in the act of creating. It not only stimulates my imagination, but guides a greater understanding of myself and of universal principles. I find a deeper connection to source and my purpose when I'm creating something new. I hope to inspire others to access their creative potential and find the kind of peace I've experienced by sculpting and creating pottery. If you'd like to see how the dragon turns out after I glaze and fire it, I'll be posting that video in the near future. Let me know in the comments if this video was helpful, inspiring, or if there's something you'd like to see me sculpt in the future. Please like, subscribe, and share with a friend.